That's weird.
What's that?
I just finished watching Scott Pilgrim Takes Off, and I wanted to add it to my anime list, but it's not on there, I guess?
Not really anime, is it?
How is it not?
I mean, it's a Canadian comic. It didn't look like anime either. I mean,
I don't really think something needs to look like anime in order to be anime. At least not in the way people typically refer to like how anime looks. Like, they're usually just talking about like the character designs. And even then, I feel like that's kind of like fallen by the wayside. You look at something like the Tatami Galaxy or Ping Pong the Animation, and neither of these really look like anime when you just focus on the character designs. But I do think when you actually start getting into the animation techniques being used, like limited animation, parallaxing, just general like animatism stuff, they definitely still look like anime, I'd say.
I think that people tend to kind of overemphasize, I guess, the inherent Japaneseness of anime. What? People say that anime is animation made in Japan, but I don't really think that works either, because, I mean, you look at something like Matarika or like Prey de Sati, and then, heck, you look at like the old Toei films from like the 50s and 60s, like, those have more visual similarities to like Disney's animation style.
Yeah, I mean, there's a notable difference. I mean, fucking look at like Astro Boy and how little stuff moves, and you compare that to like Gwanpaku Orochi or something like that. And then, there's still stuff that's animated in Japan or Korea, but we wouldn't really call those anime either. A good example, I guess, of this sort of divide would be like the Rankin Bass adaptation of The Hobbit and Return of the King. And, the Rankin Bass films were both animated at Topcraft, which was a studio in Japan, and, would have like a lot of staff that would go on to form Studio Ghibli. But, no one really calls that anime. Even though I would say that visually speaking, it has a lot more in common with anime than a lot of stuff that people still call anime. And I think that really just comes down to the idea that, like, it wasn't made for a Japanese audience, or Studio Topcraft didn't really have creative control over the project.
Well, it's interesting because that's what's kind of used to disqualify what the original 1980s Transformers properties is not being anime.
Yeah.
I guess that's more indicative of like how globalized the anime industry has become. It's interesting that we're having this conversation about an anime made by Science Saru, which got to start animating episodes of like Adventure Time. But they also have like a lot of international stuff as well at Science Saru. I mean, you look at the director of Scott Pilgrim, it's Abel Gongora. I think running into these sort of issues where we like emphasize the inherent Japaneseness of anime is something that's going to happen more and more as anime becomes more popular. I mean, hell, fuck. You don't even have to live in Japan to get like animation work in the industry anymore. Well, I guess that begs the question of like, how does one like define anime then, right?
I guess my argument, my definition of what anime is, I would start by saying that anime are works of animation made within the anime industry. And I guess that's kind of like, well, duh. But it's like, everyone says anime isn't a genre, it's a medium. I don't really think that's completely true. I think there's like some nuance there we can add, because anime isn't really a medium, animation is the medium. So what I would say is that anime is an industry of making animation in a certain way, just like how we talk about like how Hollywood is an industry of making movies in a certain kind of way, But of course, I think there are problems with that as well, because there are things made outside of the anime industry, but still made in Japan that can still be anime. I mean, that's basically what doujin anime are. I would also say that like anime is a kind of like history and like a lineage of different kinds of animation techniques and styles and sort of like database elements and the like. That kind of like starts with Astro Boy in like 1963, and then you can kind of trace that into stuff being made in the modern day.
And I guess that obviously kind of ends up spilling out internationally as well. As more and more people kind of consume anime outside of Japan and end up taking influence from it in their creative works. I mean, you look at like Scott Pilgrim itself, it's pretty obviously lifting from like the visual language of anime, even if it's not markedly anime in its art style. But then you look at like Radiant, which was an anime that aired a few years back, which was based on like a French manga influenced comic, it's known as Manfra, right? The lineage's ideas of anime, well, they start in Japan. They're not necessarily like stuck in Japan, it's all kind of interconnected interwoven.
I guess that kind of runs into the issue, though, because like I feel like any sort of definition you have of anime, you are inevitably going to run into problems. There are going to be edge cases. There are going to be shades of gray that you're not necessarily going to know how to account for. I think that's just going to be inevitable. So I don't think that there's like one clear-cut definition of anime, really. What I would say is that like we can have multiple definitions of anime. We can have multiple different ideas of what makes an anime, essentially. And these different definitions can then give us different kinds of insights, different ways to think about these different kinds of artistic works.
I mean, everyone always points to the fact that Japan just calls everything anime. So in reality, we already do technically have multiple definitions of anime. I guess that doesn't really offer any kind of clear way to define something as being an anime or not, though.
Yeah, it's a kind of like almost like unsatisfying kind of like thesis statement. It's being like, well, I don't know, it's kind of up in the air.
Obviously, my anime list has an issue reconciling it to some degree.
Yeah, well, because like a database website like my anime list or AniList or I don't know, AniDB, they have to function on like this binary logic because either something is on the database or it isn't on the database. There's no edge cases there. There's no gray. It's strictly black and white, yes or no, on or off. The only real use for like a super like clear-cut, well-defined singular definition of anime, they're really only useful for sites like my anime list to use. But inevitably, those sorts of clear-cut, rigid definitions are going to end up conflicting with like the messy nature of reality. Because like, this might shock some people, but anime are not made with my anime list in mind. But I think that, you know, websites like my anime definitely influence the way that we think about anime, because people will then say, it's like, well, it's not anime, it's not on my anime list.
Yeah, but hold on, I think we might be getting lost in the weeds here a bit. Is Scott Pilgrim anime?
I would say so. Yeah, like, even if we just go with the definition of anime that people generally use, you know, like something made in Japan for a Japanese audience, I still think this definitely counts. Because, you know, with the exception of some of the executive producers and the writers for the show, basically every other creative voice involved with making the anime are people who are workers in the anime industry. I don't think this is really a case of like a project just being outsourced and just like some of the animation being handled by a Japanese studio. I think they definitely have a lot more creative control in those regards, and I think it's still made for a Japanese audience as well, because it's still being dubbed into Japanese. You know, just because this is like an adaptation of a Canadian graphic novel, that means absolutely nothing. Otherwise, we're going to start saying that like Akage no An is not an anime. But yeah, Scott Pilgrim Takes Off, yeah, definitely an anime.
So I guess the real question then becomes, is it problematic?
Yes.